Hi, and welcome to RAVE Leader Chat, week number 4 for the Sermon on the Mount, focusing on Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 30. Just a real quick reminder of context. First, this is right after Jesus talked about fulfilling the law, not abolishing it. We talked last week about him fulfilling it, bringing it to its fullest understanding, maybe its best depth. And sort of trying to make sure that we understand that, and we need to come with that proper perspective as we sort of walk into this. And Jesus next turns to applying that to the 6th and 7th commandment. And so before we dive into this, I think it's helpful to have a sort of think about these, especially as these will continue. There's going to be sort of 6 of these little sections. To have a little outline of how Jesus does it. First, Jesus is going to say, here's what it says in the Old Testament, or here's your understanding of the Old Testament. Sort of a thumbnail sketch of it. Second, but I say to you, sort of a deepening of that of our understanding. And it might be a nuance. Sometimes they're referred to as the 6 antithesis, but they don't negate it. Jesus doesn't say, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder, but I tell you, go ahead and murder. That's not what happens here. So it really is better to be understood as a deepening and getting maybe back to the original intent or the fuller intent of the law that was given. And then third, he doesn't just leave us with here's the old standard, here's a revised standard. He sort of says, here's how you go about doing that, or here's some small steps towards obedience. So with that kind of in the background, we turn to verse 21. Question 1 in your study guide is a good one to sort of begin this. What's Jesus' authority? Who does Jesus appeal to? And the answer is really 2 things. He appeals to the Old Testament. He says in verse 21, you've heard it said that thou shalt not kill. And so he's, referring to something that it's common knowledge, commandment number 6, no dispute about it, but it does sort of beg that question, well, what were the Pharisees talking about? What were the religious professionals talking about? And as we mentioned last week, it really was that they were peeling it back to just the external behavior. And so these 2 commands that we are look at this week really sort of talk about the internal life and sort of some of the internal choices and deeds that we do. So you've heard it said, thou shalt not kill, but I tell you, he basically tells us not to sustain anger. So your translation might be, whoever is angry with his brother or sister will be liable for judgment. But the word for anger there really is sort of this word for sustained anger. We need to make sure we get this biblically accurate. There is nothing inherently evil or wrong about having a flash of anger. Someone steps on your toe and you go, oh! But Jesus is saying what you do with it after that is really significant. And so what you do with it after that, it really is it's a difference between a flash of anger and an anger fanned into flames. Sometimes some new translations will actually say nursing a grudge. It's stoking that fire. It's holding on to that fire. It's sustaining that anger. And so it really represents a decision to sustain it. So Jesus is saying, one of the subtext of murder is that you've sustained anger. You've held on to it. You've nursed it. You've made sure the flame didn't go out. And that's the heart that Jesus is trying to address. And so it's a good reminder that sometimes we sort of peel these back to be just, well, these are thoughts, right, that Jesus is talking about. But the deed, the action to decide to sustain it is really the place. That flash of anger you can't control. You're not sort of held morally culpable for that. But what you do with that afterwards is significant. And so Jesus sort of equates that's on par with murder, and your questions sort of talk about that. And then he gives a couple examples, if you will, or maybe other manifestations of this anger. And so your translation might say all sorts of things. It might have some Aramaic in it with raka. Mine just says whoever insults his brother. Yours might actually sort of say you idiot, and then you fool. Well, what's wrong with those? Well, the first one sort of minimizes the other person by questioning their mental competency. You idiot. You can't, you're not, you can't even think these things through correctly. I'm so frustrated with you because you're such an idiot. The second one, you fool, sort of begins to question the other person's moral competency. You just are ridiculous. You make so many, what a fool you are. So whether it's simmering anger, or whether it's flippant dismissal, you idiot, or whether it's verbal condemnation, you fool, all those are expressions of us minimizing and damaging somebody else in the same way, and life-limiting way that murder does. And so all three of those deserve equal judgment. And you notice there's that threefold judgment there. There's judgment for anger, there's being called in front of the council, and the potential of even going to hell. And so Jesus is appealing to sort of three standards that the people would have understood back then as an encouragement to make sure you understand what we're dealing with and how these manifestations might happen. You heard it said, thou shalt not murder. I tell you, don't sustain anger. Here's some signs that you might be sustaining anger. Here's where it spills out. And all of those are equally deserving of judgment. You know, the Jesus teaching is going to continue to sort of raise the bar to a place where we're kind of stilled and go, wait a second, and almost drive us back to the Beatitudes to realize that we are spiritually impoverished. We mourn after that. We want to hunger and thirst for righteousness. Friends, we need Jesus. And so that's what these first really do for us. But Jesus doesn't just leave us there in a moment of, well, wait a second, wow, what a failure I am. He not only reminds us that we're dependent on him, but then he gives us a couple steps to do that. And so in verse 24 and 25, we get those first little steps. And what are they? And notice there's sort of two different categories. He uses the word brothers. And before you go to worship, to go to your brother or sister, this is sort of internal for the church. This is Christian on Christian. If you've got a problem with a brother or sister in Christ, take care of it. Reconcile and do it quickly. Don't let as Ephesians teaches us, don't let the sun go down on your anger and give the devil a foothold. The devil might tempt you with anger, but what you do with it's your responsibility. And so deal with it quickly, reconcile. And then the second one is if you were heading to court for arbitration, you're supposed to go with your accuser quickly and come to terms. One translation sort of says, and become friends. Repair that relationship. And again, do it quickly. So there's some positive motivations there to sort of reconcile before you worship and make things right as you're being made right with Christ. Take care of these things because it's better to settle out of court than it is in court. And then there's that, once again, a reminder of judgment that even if you do go that, you might be imprisoned by your anger and you won't get out of that prison. And that's a terrible place to be. So Jesus is clearly deepening the standard. Clearly, this is not child's play. This is serious heart work as we seek to live this out. It makes us to be much more attentive to what's going on inside and what we're really thinking. So this week we've got two to deal with, so we move on to verse 27. Again, that Old Testament standard, you know that it's said, thou shalt not commit adultery. One translation kind of read, you shall not damage marriage, is maybe an alternate way to think about that. But as we talked about last week in the sermon, there's sexual sin is still a category of Old Testament rules and law that have not been fulfilled, that still apply, and this is echoed here. Thou shalt not commit adultery. But Jesus says, you know what, that's true, you shouldn't do that, but you also shouldn't look lustfully. And again, there's some translational differences here. The ESV says, anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart. Well, again, there's something creational about being attracted to people of the opposite sex. That's partly how relationships begin, and there's a moment of appreciating somebody else's beauty and the created beauty that God has given them that is healthy and good and well, but these things oftentimes spiral out of the proper boundaries. Dale Bruner wrote these words that I thought was a good pickup on that. Willful looking takes what God has given us in creation, the created desire for the opposite sex, and uses it outside of God's plan for marriage. And so you've got this, again, not a flash of, hey, wait a second, that person looks pleasing to the eye. It's that lustful intent. It's that sustaining anger. It's that sustaining that lustful intent. It's looking with the purpose of. And so we're reminded that both anger and lust really put other people down. They really minimize other people. And so it's this willful looking, the objectifying, the sole reason you're looking is for your own pleasure and trying to take advantage of what you see. And again, this really sort of drives us back to Jesus. Jesus' standard is very high here. How do you maintain? How do you control that heart? And it's really only by his power and his forgiveness for the times that we fail, both on our anger and our lust, but also it's his power in us to be able to live into this more fully. And so he speaks a very convicting word, and then he gives us little steps. These little steps are big steps, and they're big steps with a purpose. So we oftentimes read this and we go, wait a second, what did Jesus just say? Is he basically tells us that it's better for us to throw out our eye or cut off our hand? But what he's really saying is that to beat this type of sin, we need decisive and early action. And so these are the little steps. You need to stop it at the beginning. And he leaves us sort of intentionally vague. He doesn't unpack it for us. And I think that's intentional so that each person, as they wrestle with these two verses, these sets of verses, and particularly this one, you have to understand what the stumbling block is for you. And that's something that you need to control. And it could be everything from a TV show to a practice to whatever. You have to define it. And that's what I think is intentional here. But it demands decisive action. Jesus is saying, don't literally pull out your eye and cut off your hand. But he is literally saying, take immediate and decisive action so that you don't give lust a root in your heart. And again, that Ephesians passage for anger, don't give the devil a foothold. So that's really the concepts here, that Jesus is deepening the law, deepening our appreciation. It makes the Pharisee standard seem easy by comparison, and yet Jesus is really concerned with the battlefield of our heart. And so that's where he wants us to continue to reflect. And it does drive us to that point where we need to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and we will see God. So thanks again for your leadership. Want to just continue to remind you to keep those 6 marks of discipleship in front of your group, and just to remind them of that. This is now probably a good time to maybe start thinking, is there a way for your group to maybe reach out and be a blessing with God's love to some other folks? Right now, we are really sort of focused on, and these passages are really deepening our understanding of Scripture, marking that one. But want to just challenge you to try to raise up those other ones as we continue to walk through. So thanks so much for your leadership. Thanks for your heart for Jesus and his people. I rejoice to be in partnership and ministry as we continue to raise well-rounded disciples. Thanks, and God bless.